Welcome to the last session of the second day of the Machiavelli Marathon. I am Banu Bargu and delighted to introduce to you two distinguished scholars, Vittorio Morfino and Sebastian Torres. I will first introduce Vittorio. He's a senior researcher in history of philosophy at the University of Milan. He's the author of several books on Spinoza, Hegel, Leibniz, Althusser, early modern materialism, and Machiavelli. And he is currently working on, he's the author also of numerous articles and edited volumes, and he's currently working on an edited volume on political temporalities. Most of you already know his work on Machiavelli and Spinoza and Hegel. So without further ado, I want to leave him the floor. The title of his presentation is The Five Theses of Machiavelli's Philosophy.
So, thank you very much, Banu, for the presentation, and thank you to Filippo and Tania for the organization of the conference. So what does it mean, the Machiavellian expression, to go directly to the effectual truths of the thing, and of its opposition to the imagination of it? In effect, this passage does not appear to be self-explanatory, or rather its obviousness is more blinding than illuminating. It has been read in so different ways, imposing explicitly or surreptitiously theoretical frameworks extraneous to Machiavelli thought. What I propose in this paper is to explain the Machiavellian expression juxta propria principia, that is, starting from a theoretical framework contained in Machiavelli's own philosophy. Again, what is the meaning of the effectual truths of the thing? On the one hand, we have the term truths, whose history forces us back through the entire history of philosophy, first in the form of the Greek aletheia and then of the Latin veritas, until appearing in person in Machiavelli's Florentine vernacular. On the other hand, we have a term without history, a neologism, invented by Machiavelli that only appeared in Italian in that one passage and later in 20th century translations of Hegel. Of course, in the term effectual, there is the Latin root of effectus, facere, factum, but there is little more to be drawn from there. Moreover, they do not help to penetrate its meaning, other usages, contexts, since the syntag is an apax legomenon appearing only once in Machiavelli's work. A philological analysis of Machiavelli's syntag will not help to elucidate his philosophy. Then, effectual truth is the symbol of this philosophy, but it does not contain its meaning. In other words, effectual truth is the name of a way of doing theory, but it does not contain the meaning of this theory, namely the specific position that it occupies in the philosophical battlefield. This specific position lies in the theoretical field opened up by five philosophical theses that appear in Machiavelli's work in a practical state. In other words, although they function in the text without ever being stated openly as philosophical theses, without them it is impossible to identify the object of Machiavelli's theory, the thing about which he speaks. The first thesis, the thesis of invariance; the second, the thesis of universal variability; the third, the thesis of the primacy of the encounter of the form; the fourth, the thesis of the primacy of interweaving of times over a linear time; and fifth, the thesis of disarticulation of history and memory. Machiavelli's first philosophical thesis set out in the preface to the Discourses on Livy and constitutes the methodological premise of the entire theory. In order to establish a knowledge of history that can be translated into practice, Machiavelli asserts the immutability of the natural order, which underlies the continuous change of events. He wrote, from this it arises that infinite number who read the histories take pleasure in hearing of the variety of accidents contained in them, without thinking of imitating them, judging that imitation is not only difficult but impossible, as if even sun, elements, men had varied in motion, order, and power from what they were in antiquity. Other passages in the Discourses refer to the same invariance thesis. We can quote Discourse 1:11, Discourse 1:39, preface to Book 2, Discourse Book 3:43. To summarize, the same motion, order, power, the same mode, the same desires and humors, the same passions. Althusser rightly notes that this Machiavellian thesis does not function as a theoretical scientific proposition on history, but precisely as a philosophical thesis, a thesis that on the one hand asserts the objectivity and universality of the forthcoming scientific proposition, on the other, a thesis founding the possibility of the experimental comparison between cases. In other words, the thesis of the homogeneity of times founds the very possibility of Machiavelli's discourse, in the same way that the thesis of the homogeneity of the sublunary and celestial worlds would later found the possibility of Galileo's discourse. The second thesis, the thesis of universal variability, is found in a veiled form in many passages in Machiavelli's work. Althusser cites a passage on this subject from Discourses 1:6. Since all things of man are in motion and cannot stay steady, they must either rise or fall. For my part, I will refer to a beautiful letter written in January 31, 1515, to Francesco Vettori, in which, to justify the changes in topics and tones in their letters from matters of love to political affairs, Machiavelli writes, "This manner of ours, although to some it may be disgraceful, seems worthy of praise to me, because we imitate nature, which herself is various, and anyone who imitates nature cannot be criticized." End of quote. But the concept of fortune and the prejudice by which fortune governs human affairs directly depends on the thesis of nature as variation. In the famous chapter 25 of The Prince, Machiavelli writes, "This opinion has been believed more in our times because of the great variability of things, which have been seen and are seen every day beyond every human conjecture." End of quote. Nature is variability and fortune is unforeseeable variability, beyond all human conjecture. These ideas are certainly represented by the metaphor of the violent rivers that appears in the same chapter, but also by that of the windstorm in the Florentine Histories 634, which in Tuscany had effects unheard of in the past, and for whoever learns of it in the future will have marvelous and memorable effects. End of quote. These first two theses should not be thought of separately, as if on one hand there was the persistence of forms and on the other the continuous variety of accidents, but rather as one inside the other. We might say that the first thesis is a principle of the intelligibility of the real, while the second is it immediate correction or modulation? Two epistemological consequences follow from the formulation of the first two theses. One, a model of linear causality is rejected. Two, the model of essence tied to the model of linear causality undergoes redefinition. With regards to the rejection of model of linear causality, one could cite countless passages from Machiavelli's analysis in which we find this at work in a practical state. We can quote chapter 25 of The Prince, but also chapter 21 and 21 and 22, book 3. However, it is in the famous Ghiribizzi al Soderini, written between September 13 and 21, 1506 or 1506, that we find an epistemological declaration of the impossible linearity of the cause and effects relationships. Nature as variation is what prohibits a model of linear causality being applied to politics. The plurality of dispositions, ingegni, and the plurality of orders of things, ordini delle cose, make it unthinkable a model of time as a line along which an individual's actions unfold according to an instrumental logic. The changing times that Machiavelli speaks about are placed precisely at the intersection of these two pluralities, in which there is no space for contingency as absence of necessity, or viewed positively as a manifestation of human freedom. Necessity cannot avoid it, but it is not linear, and contingency arises not from an absence of causes, but from the complex interweaving of causes that can only be viewed from an internal partial perspective and never from a panoramic viewpoint. Now, as I said, the rejection of a serial model of causality implies a redefinition of the concept of the essence of mixed bodies. In a letter to Vittorio dated December 20, 1914, Machiavelli implicitly formulates his concept of possibility. Because all the things that have been can, I believe, be again. The concept of possibility, that is the essence of a mixed body, comes after its existence. In other words, the possible is not simply what is not contradictory on a logical plane, but what has existed or exists on an historical plane. However, what has existed and now exists does not exhaust the realm of the possible. On the contrary, this identity between possibility and factual historical existence is precisely what opens to the novum. In a letter to Vittorio dated 10 August 1513, Machiavelli writes, "I know that to this opinion of mine is opposed a natural defect of man. First, wishing to live from day to day. Second, not believing that anything can happen that has not happened." End of quote. In Machiavelli, history functions as pure facticity and not as a guarantee of an eternal return of the same. The proposition, what has been is possible, does not preclude the novum, because the novum will be possible once happened. This concept of possibility is closely linked to the concept of essence that is developed in a practical state in the work of Machiavelli. The essence of the mixed body is constituted by relations and at the same time is constantly redefined by them. Of course, we can quote Book 3, Chapter 1 on the Ritorno ai Principi, where the essence of a mixed body is thought in terms of original relation. Ritorno ai Principi is reconstitution of that relationship corrupted by the interchange with external body. Or we can quote Discourses 1:4, where the conflictual relation between the two humors, which are not poles of a simple contradiction but unequal opposites, is the inner essence of the Roman Republic, the essence, its political and military organization, and at the same time defines the nature of its external relations. Here, the external is thought not as a simple possibilitas corruptionis. The internal relation produce precise kind of external relations. But I think that we can find most interesting another model of relational essence in his discourse or dialogue concerning our languages. Here Machiavelli goes a step farther in distinguishing the concept of essence from the traditional concept of form. In analyzing the life of a language, Machiavelli notes that that natural exchange does not appear only as an agent of disintegration, as an agent of corruption, but as something that enters constitutively into its essence, so that the power of a language does not consist in maintaining its identity by rejecting otherness, but in its capacity to change by including otherness. I quote, "Languages cannot be simple, and it is better that they are mixed with other languages. But a native language converts words that it has borrowed from others into its own use. And it is so powerful that the borrowed words do not disorder it, but rather it disorders theirs. Because that which it bears from the others, it pulls to itself in a such manner that it seems to be its own." End of quote. Any language, to use the words of Balibar, exceeds the possibility of an identification with a natural or historical property of a community, because it is subject to a process of continuous transformation from its more or less violent interference with other languages. Its identity is not defined by an expressive bond with the subject, but by a complex system of relationships, of power relations that define an always temporary interiority. Machiavelli writes, "Because you cannot find a language that speaks about all things on its own without having borrowed from others. Because in conversing together, people from different provinces take sayings from each other. In addition to this, whenever new disciplines or new arts come to a city, new words must come there, created in the language from which those disciplines or arts have come. But by being transformed in speech, by the modes, cases, difference, and accents, they enter into the same kinship, fanno una medesima consonanza, with the words in the language that they encounter and thus become a part of it." End of quote. Therefore, the essence is a relationship, but a relationship whose contingency lies not only in the always present possibility of disintegration, but also in the possibility of new forms of aggregation. In another case, however, is a process directed by some sort of telos. So I come to the primacy of the encounter over the form. This lack of telos in natural variation is asserted by Machiavelli in a specific thesis, then I would formulate in Althusserian terms the thesis of the primacy of the encounter over the form. This primacy is expressed in Machiavelli's work in The Theory of Virtue and Fortune, appearing in chapter 25. Virtue, which he calls free will, is nothing more than the necessary inclination of the agent, and fortune is a change beyond every human conjecture. It is the encounter between these two orders of necessity that makes the model of a transitive or serial causality inapplicable to historical knowledge. And yet, this does not mean, as Cassirer believes, that Machiavelli gives up on a rational explanation of politics and the history. Quite the contrary. Human action is certainly exercised on time that are constantly changing, and this incessant variability is presented by Machiavelli in the form of the ancient pagan deity, fortune, but freed from any idea of distributive regularity. But this does not lead to a denial of the intelligibility of the real. It is precisely because a cause can produce different effects, just as an effect can be produced by different causes, that we need a more complex model of rationality capable of accounting for the complexity of the real that arises out of the conjunction of two necessities, the necessity of virtue and the necessity of the times. The conjunction has a philosophical name in Machiavelli, that is occasione. What is affirmed in the well-known passage on the occasione of the book 6 of the Prince is precisely that an historical event like the founding of a state is not the effect of a mythical first cause, which lies at the origin of a linear development in a historical time ab urbe condita. Rather, it is the result of an encounter between virtue and fortune in the form of occasion, an encounter that can give rise to a world, but also put an end to a world. It is a deconstruction of the concept of first cause. Occasion is not kairos. I wrote that before your intervention. Is not kairos in the sense I will say. It is not an instant in time responsible for a destiny. It is not the eruption of eternity into time. Rather, it covered the semantic field of event, circumstance, situation. Now, if you understand this Machiavellian concept correctly, not as an interruption of necessity, but as a conjunction of differential necessity, it sums up the meaning of the first three theses, acting in a sense as their hinge. It is affirmed the primacy of the relationship of things over some inner essence they may possess, and the primacy of the aleatory over any theology or teleology of the cause. The fourth thesis on the primacy of interweaving of times over linear time. The very idea of plural temporalities, of being having a plurality of rhythms, although not explicitly discussed by Machiavelli, is the condition of conceivability of the concept of occasion. In a theory with a single temporality, whether conceived from the perspective of a creationist theology or a philosophy of history, the power of the Machiavellian concept of occasion would be completely neutralized. As Yankelevich writes so aptly, occasion is not the instant of a solitary becoming, but the instant complicated by polychronism. That is, by sporadicism and by the plurality of durations. If durations were arranged between each other by an immemorially predetermined harmony, instead of marking out different measures of time, or if they created an absolutely formless cacophony between them, instead of lining up from time to time, there would be no place for occasion. Miraculous occasion depends on polymetry and polyrhythmy, as it does on the momentary interference of becoming. End of quote. From this perspective, the way Machiavelli retroscribed Polybius' theory of anacyclosis is paradigmatic. The serial temporality exhibited in the succession of forms of power appears as an abstraction of the imagination when faced with the reality of complex historical and political relations. The intersection of the different cycles produces a temporality traversed by ruptures and discontinuities. However, the distance it takes from the theory of anacyclosis is even more radical. Machiavelli does not limit himself to complicating the framework inherited from Polybius. He does not conceive chance at the intersection of the necessary development of multiple cycles. Rather, he places chance at the origin of the form, When Machiavelli approaches his subject, the history of Roman people, the philosophy of history is abandoned in favor of a study of the laws and institutions, leggi e ordini, that allow the state to regulate and stabilize the power relations of the society's humors. Okay. But these laws and institutions are not the effect of a mythical legislator like Lycurgus in Sparta, and the denial of the first cause embodied by the legislator's founder, who in the political space occupies the place that God has in the Christian cosmology, brings with it, with the same theoretical move, the denial of the series of transitive causes resulting from it. So many accidents arose in it through the disunion between the plebs and the Senate, that what an order had not done, chance did. Time is not plural simply because there are more cycles that interfere with each other, but more profoundly because any apparent historical linearity consists of an interweaving of times, rhythms, and encounters that constitutes the specific quality of a conjuncture. This conception of time is precisely what forces the disarticulation of truth and memory that is central to the remarkable chapter 5 of Book 2 of the Discourses. Memory is not the conceptual double of history, but a fragment saved from powerful causes of destruction. Memory is presented not as a conceptual double, I repeat, but as a fragment saved from the powerful causes that destroy human memory. This fragment of memory is no way an expression of the totality. No reason understood as sense precedes over its survival. It is what remains of the encounters between the forces of nature and human society, and of the encounters between different societies. I leave aside the analysis of the different causes of oblivion to come to my conclusion. Okay? Okay, conclusion. The thing about which Machiavelli's discourse presents the factual truths, thus becomes visible to the theory through the lenses that these 5 philosophical theses provide. The term thesis comes from the Greek thesis, which means position. A thesis is a position, while the statement of a thesis is a taking of position in the given battlefield. Now, when using categories such as Western metaphysics or ontotheology, there is always a risk of falling into generalization that lose sight of the specificity of the individual authors. However, these categories become extremely useful when used as a background at the horizon of a fictitiously homogeneous temporality regarding which it is possible to emphasize not only what escapes, but also what is opposed to it. Machiavelli's thesis stake out a position against Western metaphysics or ontotheology, one that, to state it openly, is radically materialistic, materialisme de la conjoncture. I think there is enough to say an expression like this, but if there is not, I try to... Okay. This is the reason why Machiavelli's philosophy has for a long time been invisible to Western thought. On the one hand, of course, because it is contained in a practical state in his political theory, and is therefore not directly perceivable or easily identifiable given the new, unheard of meaning of his thesis. On the other hand, however, this invisibility seems to have a deeper reason, taking the form of a repression, inasmuch as it is not limited to going beyond the horizon of Western metaphysics, but in setting itself up as the truth of the thing, relegates all of metaphysics to the imagination of it. Thank you.
Perfect timing. We have 15 minutes for questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Vittorio. I think I agree very much with what you have explained about la verità effettuale. But if we try to be faithful to Machiavelli, as I think we should, can we remain content with being good scholars? And some of you are amazingly good scholars. Shouldn't we try to assume the consequences and to think through the position that we are taking? And if we take a position as only scholars, that is to say, if we do scholasticism, what kind of Machiavellian thought is that? The more so when Machiavelli provides fundamental tools for addressing our contemporary situation today. You know, I could mention a number of them, but I'd rather let other people talk. But I just mentioned, for example, one. You know, when he compares a mad multitude with a mad prince, mad multitude can be persuaded by words, but a mad prince, that is to say, an oligarchy, only il ferro. It can only be cured by el ferro. This is a part of our situation. What is new in our situation is the mechanical, automatic character of capital circulation. But, so, going back to the beginning, shouldn't we try to have more of a Machiavellian attitude, more of a Machiavellian stance, and not do just a scholarship, which I insist, if it is only scholarship, is just scholasticism?
I ask? I don't know if is the right place with we are filmed to found an armed group, perhaps. No. If you want, I agree with you, but okay, it was an attempt to produce a materialistic philosophy. A partire da Machiavelli, using Machiavelli's tools.
Okay. I just had a question about the fourth of the theses, which if I remember correctly, is what you call the primacy of the encounter over form.
The third. Okay.
Third. Well, in any case, about that thesis. And in the formulations in the prince in the 6th chapter and then the last, there's two different formulations about the manner in which the occasion gives material such that a form, a political form, can be introduced into it. And in the last chapter, obviously, it's with respect to the situation of Italy. So I was wondering, isn't it the case that the concept, that an occasion basically only becomes an occasion retroactively once a form is introduced into it? Whether that succeeds or not is a different matter. It seems that were there to be a sort of ontology of occasions that is separate from the politics of forcing forms into this material, then the account would be a very different one. So I wonder if primacy is the right term regarding the relationship between encounter and form in those formulations in the chapter 6 and 26.
I think that, yes, Machiavelli says the occasion is known when is captured by the virtue, and it comes in vain if it's not captured by the virtue. In this sense, I think an occasion becomes an occasion when there is the encounter. So the terms change, and the relation of the terms change fortune and virtue. So in a sense, does not exist before the encounter as such. But in another sense, the elements are there. And I think to what Althusser says about the atoms and la prise, the elements are abstract before the encounter. So you know the elements of the encounter only after the encounter, but at the same time, the elements after the encounter are not the same elements of what they were before.
Vorrei fare due notazioni. La prima è che io mi chiedo se non dobbiamo trarre tutte le conseguenze che si possono trarre del fatto che la verità effettuale della cosa di cui facevi un po' il punto di partenza è appunto un evento semantico, un evento linguistico straordinario, cioè che non si ripete. Cioè, fondare un discorso filosofico su questa specie di apax per me pone un problema. Ecco, quindi questa è la prima notazione. La seconda notazione invece è qualcosa che ha a che fare con ciò che la critica italiana chiama la questione della lingua. Prendere come esempio del discorso su natura e forma il discorso, ovvero dialogo sulla lingua, pone un problema perché lì la questione della natura, secondo me, non fa parte di un dibattito tra natura e forma, fa parte di un dibattito interno alla questione della lingua sull'opposizione tra la scelta della natura e la scelta dell'arte, cioè due scelte di lingue diverse, tra virgolette, tra le quali Machiavelli ha fatto. Lui si schiera in un campo, chiaramente, e lì penso che veramente il punto di riferimento sia meno filosofico, aristotelico per esempio, o post-aristotelico, non so come chiamarlo, quanto un riferimento retorico, letterario, che parlava a tutti quelli che lo sentivano quando, per esempio, sentivano parlare di questo testo, che è poi un testo probabilmente abbastanza particolare, insomma, che come si sa, insomma, abbiamo pochi manoscritti, non ha circolato prima del Seicento, è una reazione alla discussione di Orti Oricellari della traduzione di De Vulgari Eloquentia da Trissino. Quindi, ecco, mi interrogo e vorrei sapere cosa ne pensi, insomma, sull'uso strettamente filosofico di questo dibattito linguistico, così come l'hai utilizzato nel tuo ragionamento, ecco.
Allora, sì, allora ti rispondo in italiano. Sì. Quanto alla prima questione, Machiavelli usa una volta questo termine, però a partire da quell'uso c'è una lunga tradizione interpretativa che si domanda qual è il significato di questo uso, tradizione interpretativa che appunto cerca di imporre una serie di quadri per dare una risposta, perché in effetti è molto difficile trovare questa risposta in Machiavelli stesso, precisamente perché lui lo dice e poi non ci dice più nulla di questo. Io stesso ho lavorato su Spinoza e Machiavelli, su delle indicazioni di Etienne, imponendo il modello di Spinoza a Machiavelli, quindi prestandogli la filosofia di Spinoza in un certo senso. Ora, io credo che tentare di rispondere cercando, diciamo, all'interno del discorso di Machiavelli, che è molto disuguale, naturalmente io ho preso dove ho potuto, mi sono riletto tutto e tutto quello che ho trovato ho cercato di utilizzarlo. E questo per venire al secondo contesto, alla seconda questione, naturalmente si può contestualizzare, storicizzare e quello che probabilmente avrei dovuto fare, ma a questo punto avrei spezzettato il discorso in modo da renderlo quasi incomprensibile. In realtà lì c'è un modello, secondo me, di transindividualità molto forte e che riguarda non solo le lingue ma le società. Per cui perché non usarlo per affermare una tesi filosofica? E tra l'altro una tesi filosofica che è affermata lì, ma di fatto il primato della relazione sulla forma è affermato attraverso tutta l'opera di Machiavelli, per cui semplicemente lì, secondo me, emerge in modo paradigmatico in un certo senso. Poi, io credo che, per esempio, andando a vedere dei lavori filologici che sono stati fatti su Lucrezio, ma anche mettendo in relazione Machiavelli e Lucrezio da un punto di vista storico, questo discorso emerge. Cioè, in fondo mi sembra... Basta.
Yes, thank you so much. The previous intervention by Carlos, which you refused to react to, nevertheless seems to me, I don't say I am able to give the answer that you are not able to give. Of course, I'm not. But
I would like.
It seems to me that it helps. It raises an interesting question, which also concerns our interpretation of the phrase, the one that we've been discussing for years, and you've been just adding publicly, of course, a new contribution to that. La verità effettuale della cosa. It's an invention, it's an apax legomenon, as you said. Effettuale never existed before. Therefore, the conjunction, of course, depends on that invention. That was your point. It seems to me that you left aside the beginning of the phrase, the sentence, andar dritto o drietto alla verità effettuale della cosa, which people like me and probably many others who had a bad acquaintance with Italian or that Italian, and the translations sometimes in French, I don't know in English, are misleading. They suggest that it means to go directly, to address directly, whether from what I understand now it means something like going after. Anyway, so this indicates a gesture. My whole point concerns the relationship between the semantic aspect and, say, the pragmatic aspect of this sentence in a broad sense. It seems to me that your explanation fairly gave very interesting, I don't know if it's true, but it's very interesting, very suggestive, interpretation for precisely effettuale in terms of this materialist philosophy of time, occasion, matter, etc. It doesn't really explain why Machiavelli uses the term truth, except in the very last phrase of your intervention, when you suggest that this makes sense because it's a radical rejection and of and opposition to the philosophical tradition as such. So the subtext would be something like this would be the pragmatic element. The subtext, as I understand you'll tell me if you agree with that, would be something like what my kind of philosophy or discourse or etc. is concerned with are effects. Or the effectivity of some processes which are not to be explained or even understood in terms of the traditional metaphysical categories. And now I tell you this is the truth. And the truth is not in the other place, the place of the philosophy. So truth here would be the index, so to speak, of the assertion itself. It would be on the side of the pragmatic, on the pragmatic side rather than the semantic side. It would have nothing. Machiavelli's phrase has nothing to do with explaining what the truth is. Whether it's how we understand the concept of truth. It has everything to do with the use of the power of the category truth to say the truth is where I tell you and not where you believe it is. So that's the first possibility, I end. But then as soon as your interest has been raised, as I suggest, I mean it's of course also your point of view, in the combination, I mean, of sense and action, or semantic and illocutionary effect of the phrase, then the term effettuale acquires also another dimension, it seems to me. And of course this is influenced by Althusser and his considerations on the effect that Machiavelli's discourse produces not only in the past but in the present, you know. So the fact that Machiavelli's discourse produces an effect within our contemporary conjuncture as much as we read it. But we read it because Machiavelli wrote it as a scriptor with a certain intention, which was precisely to produce an effect. So I leave aside, because tomorrow we are going back to Althusser and to the continuation of that in Althusser, and particularly his last remarks on that, which are as you know, a desperate reversal of this idea that Machiavelli is talking to us, is speaking to us in the present. In the last text that he wrote, he writes, "This is no longer the case. We no longer have any use for Machiavelli, etc." But leave that aside. So it seems to me that effettuale also must mean something, or I suggest, I ask you, must mean something like a truth that produces an effect, and not only that, a knowledge that reflects or explains or describes an effectivity, if you like, but also a truth that produces an effect. And this is where Carlos' question cannot be entirely avoided, because it precisely asks about the kind of effects that we associate in our current situation with the reading of Machiavelli.
Va bene se rispondo in italiano? Sì, capisco. Io credo che l'effetto non sia l'effetto delle tesi filosofiche di Machiavelli non sia immediatamente politico. L'effetto delle tesi filosofiche di Machiavelli sono rendere possibile un campo di un discorso politico che può produrre degli effetti politici, ma non è immediatamente una strategia del principe, è una strategia della strategia. No, però secondo me è importante mantenere l'autonomia dei livelli, relativa naturalmente, ma la filosofia apre un campo di discorso, la filosofia di Machiavelli rende possibile il discorso di Machiavelli sulla politica. Dopodiché il discorso di Machiavelli sulla politica tenta di produrre degli effetti nel suo tempo. In questo senso è effettuale, cioè il primo effetto è la teoria politica di Machiavelli. Poi che cosa dipenda dalla teoria politica di Machiavelli?
Now we're running a little bit late, but I have at least 3 or 4 people who want to ask questions. So can we go over, Filippo? Okay, 5 more minutes maybe? Okay, if you can keep your questions brief, then we can fit in a lot of people.
Rapidissimamente. Io richiamo molto brevemente la relazione anche di Alison Brown, no? e la domanda che aveva posto Miguel, cioè si ha anche perché mi pare che la presentazione che tu hai fatto insomma è legata a Lucrezio, no? Pienamente legata a Lucrezio e quindi si ha uso questa parola, il paradosso di una posizione filosofica come è stata definita da Miguel, quietistica, che però è legata ad una invece posizione politica nel suo riuso attivistica. Effettivamente questo è una questione, insomma, tu adesso l'hai appena affrontata. Vorrei che insomma dicessi qualcosa di più, perché il modo in cui tu hai presentato le 5 tesi costantemente faceva emergere, almeno così mi è parso, la questione del prendere posizione, della prospettiva da cui si fa, no? Mentre, come tu sai, in Lucrezio tutto questo è legato ad una prospettiva chiara, definita, che è quella del saggio, appunto come oggi vedevamo nella relazione di Ellison, che guarda da lontano accadere le sfortune, insomma. Mentre in Machiavelli si ha proprio il rovesciamento di questo, no? Chi analizza è coinvolto in ciò che analizza, ecco. Quindi non è affatto un approccio speculativo. Allora, come da queste 5 tesi nasce il particolare approccio politico e il particolare approccio alla politica di Machiavelli? Come la vedi?
Dunque, riguardo a Lucrezio, secondo me, questo è quello che avevo tentato di mostrare in un articolo che abbiamo pubblicato insieme su Lucrezio e Machiavelli. La mia idea è che Machiavelli utilizzi il Lucrezio fisico, non il Lucrezio etico-politico. Cioè c'è un utilizzo del modello fisico, dell'incontro degli atomi, della necessità, della contingenza, dei mostri. A mio avviso questa tesi filosofica è una presa di posizione, cioè le tesi filosofiche aprono un campo teorico che costituisce la possibilità di una presa di posizione differente, cioè non riesco a vedere in un altro modo, cioè in che senso? Tu mi domandi se perché queste tesi non aprono una posizione quietistica?
Sì, diciamo, come si passa dal campo filosofico, come tu l'hai presentato, al campo pienamente politico. C'è una differenza o non c'è una differenza?
Beh, c'è la differenza tra, diciamo, le tesi filosofiche sono dentro la teoria politica. Cioè non sono, come dire, le tesi filosofiche allo stesso tempo rendono possibile quella teoria politica, e quindi il Lucrezio che lui utilizza rendono possibile quella specifica teoria politica e come dire, non sono qualcosa che viene prima e quindi poi ci si pone il problema di che politica fare. È quella politica che in un certo senso contiene allo stato pratico queste tesi filosofiche. No, dicevamo prima con Jeremy, per esempio, che la tradizione Lucrezio, Machiavelli, Spinoza, come dire, non è facile dimostrare che esista una tradizione di questo genere dentro gli scritti di questi autori, ma se tu vai a vedere le refutazioni, le confutazioni che vengono fatte, in realtà le confutazioni stabiliscono immediatamente la linea del nemico. La linea del nemico è l'epicureismo, il machiavellismo e lo spinozismo, a cui viene data una precisa continuità, per cui, come dire, che quelle tesi filosofiche contengano una forza politica in sé, cioè, mi sembra dimostrato dall'opposizione stessa e dalla linea di confutazione che
in the interest of time, I propose to have the 2 questions and then have 1 answer. Is that okay?
Sì.
Okay.
Vorrei tornare alla tua citazione sul linguaggio, che io trovo straordinaria e assolutamente pertinente. Mi sembra che si possa anche contestualizzare e generalizzare al tempo stesso, perché contestualizzare non significa semplicemente andare sul particolare. Se consideriamo cosa avveniva più o meno in quegli anni, 1492 Nebrija consegna a Isabella di Castiglia la grammatica castigliana, è la prima grande operazione ortopedica sul linguaggio, è il primo tentativo di costringere il linguaggio all'interno di una struttura nazionale, noi diremmo adesso. In questo caso la tua citazione è esattamente l'antinebrica. Mi sembra che da questo punto di vista, se noi consideriamo quanto è stato importante e quanto è ancora importante il linguaggio nella costruzione di una gabbia spazio-temporale, probabilmente il fatto che Machiavelli abbia quelle posizioni sul linguaggio in qualche modo sostiene la tua ultima tesi sulla molteplicità dei tempi. Non so se tu vedi questa connessione, per me è assolutamente perspicua.
Sì, no, ti ringrazio. No, sono d'accordo. Cioè, come dire...